Good morning, grade 8s, and welcome to social studies for this week. This is going to be a little bit of a longer video, and it's a continuation on the thoughts that we were having last week as well. So this is kind of to tie things together and to start working on our theme. There is a Zoom call that I will be hosting tomorrow at 2 o'clock, between 2 and probably 2:45, that I'm going to use that time to discuss how this information gets tied in to your year-end project and what that's going to look like. So it's going to be really important that you tune in for that. If you can't make it to the Zoom, that's okay. I'm going to record it and I will post that, but do make sure that you watch it because it's going to be key. So what we're going to be doing during this lesson is we're going to be finishing off the compare and contrast from week 2. So if you go to the website off of the GSS library, you will see the compare and contrast, and then it'll look something like this. And you don't need to print off this exact page. You can just use a sheet of lined paper and divide it into the different sections, the 6 sections, and then do a half a page each. Because it could have quite a bit of information in it, so don't feel like you need to print it off. This is just kind of the starts of it. Last week, some of you guys did take the time to do some reading from the Renaissance chapter and the Middle Ages chapter of the textbook, and that's great. That was optional, but this week it's time to at least give a skim read of that, because that information is going to add context to your project that we're going to be talking about tomorrow. So make sure that you do take some time to look through those 2 PDFs there. All right? So here we go. Let us start with our presentation here. You don't need to take notes, but it is important to listen carefully and fill in the point form stuff that you can get into the chart. So we're comparing the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and this, of course, will help you fill in the chart, but what I would want you to really start thinking about is, why did things change? What was the impetus for change? What was the catalyst for change? The thing that drove the idea forward that change was necessary. Make sense? So let's talk about that now. All right, so we're starting with this, I'm just following the chart. So we're starting with social structures. And in the Middle Ages, because we've already studied this, I'm not going to give as much detail, but just a review. So there was a very distinctive social class system during the Middle Ages. Most medieval people were peasants, over 90%, but the divide between peasants and nobility was very clear-cut. The clergy was also an important part of the social order during the Middle Ages, though they were not necessarily considered a separate class altogether. First of all, there's royalty. So the royals were the highest of the social classes in the Middle Ages. The royalty included kings, queens, princes, and princesses. Royals had complete power over the land and political and economic decisions during the Middle Ages. The king was the highest authority in the land. The king had to make laws, attempt to remove poverty from his kingdom, and to take care of the citizens in his kingdom. Though they did not rule often alone, queens did play an important role in the medieval class system as well. Queens were usually second in command to the kings and often served as regents when the king was unfit to rule, either because he was ill or considered too young to make intelligent decisions. Queens also served as hostesses and event planners. Princes. Depending on their birth order, a prince may have been next in line to the throne when his father died. Princes most likely sat in on the courtly meetings. And princesses were not usually next in line for the throne unless there was no male heir who could take the place on the throne that was being left. Princesses were often married off to princes in other countries in order to secure long-lasting, friendly economic and political ties with those countries. And sometimes this was successful, but more often than not, it backfired. So that kind of sucks to be a princess. So if you're looking at the noble classes, because the royal families are relatively small, The nobility had the most power of the social classes in the Middle Ages. Nobility included two types of nobles, one that was hereditary, so passed down from father to son, and then there were those that were bestowed upon them through a rise through power, not through family relations. So some of the hereditary nobles were dukes, and their main responsibility of a duke was to be the ruler of a province. A duke was also the direct superior of a court. The duke was the highest ranking in the nobility, and the female equivalent of a duke was a duchess. There's also barons. A baron was responsible first to its king and second to the people who lived on his manor. The king might require the baron to serve in the military or engage in various other activities. By complying with the king's requirements, the baron was possibly able to earn a higher title, more land, or prosperous marriages for his children and other family members. If he did not comply, the barons could lose his manor, his luxurious lifestyle, or maybe even his life. As a percentage of each manor's crops was sent to the king, a baron also had to make sure that all the serfs on his estate were protected in order to make sure plentiful crops were produced. A baron also sometimes served as judges in a court of crime or passed out sentences in court. Now let's talk about the non-hereditary nobles. They still had a pretty important role in society, and that is the knights. Knights were often served as vassals during the Middle Ages. Their primary duty as vassal was to aid and protect the lord in his army. They would also assist their lord in court and watch over the lord's manor, keeping an eye on the day-to-day activities of the manor. Now let's talk about everybody else. So there's the peasants, and of course they're the lowest social rank during the Middle Ages. The peasant class included freemen, who had some rights and land, serfs, who had no rights, and the slaves, who were bought and sold. Kind of aside from all of this was the clergy. So the clergy was not considered one of the social classes of the Middle Ages, but it did play an important and influential role at the time, and did have a hierarchy of its own. The Pope was naturally at the top of the order, while nuns and monks were at the lowest end. So the Pope was the head of the Catholic Church. For much of the Middle Ages, popes were the last word in anything to do with the Church. They had heavy influence over political and economic decisions, as well as, for a time anyway. However, towards the end of the Middle Ages, popes lost their political power when the Catholic Church came under a lot of scrutiny from the public. There was a ton of corruption. If you're ever looking for some interesting information about corruption in the Catholic Church, look up the Medicis. Total murder, total espionage, total craziness going on. Not something you would expect from a church. Then you've got the bishops. So after the Pope, the bishop was the highest ranking official in the church. Bishops were considered to be nobility and were usually very wealthy. So they had many responsibilities, such as settling annulments of marriages. Priests gave mass in the church in the castle. They were responsible for collecting church taxes and spreading alms to the poor. Because they were usually the only people in the village who could read and write, priests often were the ones who kept records for the church. And then the monks were the lowest ranking in the church. Monks lived in monasteries and usually wore brown robes. Monks devoted their lives to learning, and they could usually read and write in Latin. Some of the first Bibles were scribed by monks, as the printing press had not yet been invented. So that's kind of the social order during the Middle Ages. So now, during the Renaissance, things are a little bit different. So a few hundred years go by, and there were some key changes within society, and this is what I want you to think of. What caused these changes? Oh, my coffee maker's turning itself off. So the social classes of the Renaissance, the people of Renaissance Florence, like most city-states of the era, were composed of four social classes: the nobles, the merchants, the tradesmen, and the unskilled workers. So the nobles usually lived on large estates outside the city walls. They owned most of the city's land, so the nobles had the control that way. The nobles served as military officers, royal advisors, and politicians. skip a couple pages here. So the nobles were disdainful of the merchant class, who gained wealth in industries like wool processing, shipbuilding, and banking. The merchants sought to protect their wealth by controlling the government and marrying into noble families. They became patrons of great artists in order to gain public favor. The tradesmen of Florence were the craft workers and shopkeepers. Most tradesmen belonged to guilds, organizations that established the quality, set rules for membership, and limited outside competition. And then, of course, there's the unskilled workers, who were the lowest class of city workers. These laborers did not have job protection and were very dependent on their employers. Workers who violated rules could have their wages withheld or could be discharged from their jobs. So as difficult as their lives were, however, the unskilled urban workers were better off than the peasants who lived in the rural areas. The poorest of the peasants were the sharecroppers who worked on land owned by nobles. Life in the peasant farms was difficult, and starvation was very common, which, I mean, if you're taking the time to grow all the food for your noble, it would be nice if they shared it. So the social classes became less distinct as the Renaissance progressed. The humanist ideas led to increased rights for individuals, but the class system remained in place in Florence and throughout most of Europe long after the end of the Renaissance. So now, I want you to take a minute, maybe pause the video when I'm done talking for a sec, and think about what caused the change in society to start diminishing the prevalence of the social classes. So pause the video here. All right, so into the government in the Middle Ages here. So as we practiced, I don't know if you remember the game that we did with feudalism, where you all started off with the chocolates in your cup, and you had to gradually whittle yourself down unless you were one of the nobles. So feudalism was the leading form of government in the Middle Ages. Power was definitely held by the monarchy, held by the higher end people of the social classes. The lords would pledge support and fealty to the monarchy, and in return they would be given lands to rule over. So this land, they would raise crops, they would raise animals, and they would make money off of producing different supplies that society needed. The vassals, who are higher class servants, were offered land to work by the lords. In exchange, they would give loyalty and or the produce of the land. So whatever they grew or made, they would give a percentage of that to their lord in recompense for the usage of their land. But it's a pretty straightforward, I own this, I let you borrow this, you pay me this. It's a heavily taxed system of social hierarchy is essentially what the government did. However, in the Renaissance, there were some differences. There were no longer just one type of government. So there's three types of governments in the Renaissance. The first is a princedom. So a prince was an individual, whether called a duke, count, marquis, or just seigneur, which is lord, who ruled a state, usually with the support of his family. The monarchy, which is the same as before, was a princedom sanctioned by a much longer tradition, stronger institutions, and greater claims of legitimacy for its rulers. The majority of monarchies, for example, England, France, Portugal, Scotland, and Spain, were hereditary, while Poland, Hungary, Bohemia, and the Holy Roman Empire were elective. And then this is where things start to get vastly different in the Renaissance times, and there were several republics. as a form of government. So the smallest and most unusual political unit was the city-state, consisting of a major town or city and its surrounding territory or farms and villages. An oligarchy, usually drawn from the merchant elite of the town, ruled republic. So an oligarchy, just in case you don't know, is a small group of nobility, wealthy, connected people who have a great deal of influence over society. This is pretty close to what the United States is run like now. However, all of this was very complex, and it shifted rapidly because there was a development of diplomacy. There were some changes in the way that governments were being run in this regard, because it wasn't just, I'm going to kill you and take this anymore. It's a matter of making sure that everybody is being taken care of, and they want a little bit more fairness in their society. So the resident ambassador, that is a permanent representative of one government to another, was a Renaissance innovation, and this is still something that we use today. So that's a big change. He went to go live in the capital city or court of another state, where he conveyed messages between his government and the host government, trying to create an atmosphere of assistance and wanting to help each other out. So a little bit of this has to do with, pardon me here, well, there was a few different reasons. So there's this thing called humanism, and the humanism is a big reason why things started to change in the diplomatic areas. So the notion that ancient wisdom and eloquence lay slumbering in the Dark Ages until awakened by the Renaissance was the creation of the Renaissance itself. The idea of the revival of classical antiquity is one of those great myths, comparable to the idea of the universal civilizing mission of imperial Rome, or to the ideas of progress in a modern industrial society, by which an era defines itself in history. Like all such myths, it is a blend of fact and invention. Classical thought and style permeated medieval culture in ways that were past counting. Most of the authors known to the Renaissance were also known to the Middle Ages as well, while the classical texts that were discovered by the humanists were often not originals, but medieval copies preserved in the... Oh, stop it, dogs. Harley, down. Thank you. Sorry, guys. The Middle Ages had produced at least two earlier revivals of classical antiquity, so the so-called Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries saved many ancient works from destruction or oblivion, passing them down to posterity in its beautiful, minuscule script, which influenced the humanist scripts of the Renaissance. A 12th century Renaissance saw the revival of Roman law, Latin poetry, and Greek science, including most of the whole corpus of Aristotelian writings known today. Spider, can you back off? You're probably blocking the whole camera there. Back off. Oh, dogs. Okay. So you can see how government has changed there. And I want you to pause the video, let me sort out my dogs, and I want you to think about what caused that change, knowing that they had some of the same ideas in the Middle Ages, but they didn't act on that information. They waited until a little bit later before they started changing things. All right, pause the video. Dogs, down. We're going in a kennel. All right, so now let's talk about trade in medieval Europe. Trade and commerce in the medieval world developed to such an extent that even relatively small communities had access to weekly markets and perhaps a day's travel away, larger but less frequent fairs, where the full range of consumer goods of the period was set out to tempt the shopper and small retailer. Markets and fairs were organized by large estate owners, town councils, and some churches and monasteries who granted a license to do so by their sovereign, hoped to gain revenue from stallholder fees, and boost the local economy as shoppers used peripheral services, international trade. They used peripheral services. So things like they stayed at a hotel, they ate at a restaurant. International trade had become present since the Roman times, but improvements in transportation and banking, as well as the economic development of Northern Europe, caused a boom in the 9th century. English wool, for example, was sent in huge quantities to manufacture in Flanders. The Venetians, thanks to the Crusades, expanded their trade interests to the Byzantine Empire, which is east, and the Levant, the new financial instruments evolved, which allowed even small investors to fund the trade expeditions which crisscrossed Europe by sea and land. So we've talked about the markets and shops. The trade fairs were large-scale sales events typically held annually in large towns where people could find greater range of goods than they might find in the more local markets, and traders could buy goods wholesale. Prices tended to be cheaper because there was more competition between sellers of specific items. Fairs boomed in France, England, Flanders, and Germany in the 12th and 13th centuries. One of the most famous areas was the Champagne region of France. So international trade is starting to ramp up as well. Trade in Europe in the early Middle Ages continued to some degree as it had under the Romans, with shipping being fundamental to the movement of goods from one end of the Mediterranean to the other, and via rivers and waterways from the north to south and vice versa, because it's a lot easier to move a large quantity of goods along a waterway than it is to move it over land. So there was movement of goods, especially luxury goods, like precious metals, horses, and slaves, to name a few. But what quantities and other transactions involved money, barter, or gift exchange is unclear. Many Jewish and Syrian merchants have filled the gap left by the demise of the Romans up to the 7th century, while the Levant also traded with North Africa and the Moors in Spain. It is probable that international trade still remained the affair of the elite aristocracy, and it supported economies rather than drove them. So it wasn't a huge thing. They definitely had trading ports and regulations, so international businesses was now booming as many city ports established international trading posts where foreign merchants were allowed to live temporarily and trade their goods. In the early 13th century, Genoa, for example, had 198 resident merchants, of which 95 were Flemish and 51 were French, and that's in the middle of Italy. Oh, stop it, dogs. So there's different people trading all over the place. So it's just starting to become a little bit more international, and the trade fairs were huge and often lasted a really long time. In the Renaissance, however, gets a little bit, it gets more. So during the Renaissance, the European economy grew dramatically, particularly in the area of trade. Developments such as population growth, improvements in banking, expanding trade routes, and new manufacturing systems led to overall increase in commercial activity. Feudalism, which had been widespread in the Middle Ages, gradually disappeared, and early forms of capitalism emerged. This is really important to understand here, that they went from a top-down system to a anybody can make money system. And that's the system that we still run on today. The changes affected many aspects of European society, forcing people to adapt to different kinds of work and new ways of doing business with others. Agriculture is super important because everybody needs to eat and everybody needs to wear clothing, and they couldn't produce synthetic fibers, so it was all produced through farming and agriculture. So In the Middle Ages, Europe was overwhelmingly rural, and its economy depended most entirely on agriculture. Towns and cities did not become significant centers of production until the late Middle Ages, but after that time, their economic importance increased rapidly. During the Middle Ages, most peasants were serfs, individuals tied by law to the land they worked. By the late 1400s, however, serfdom was declining through Europe, and the peasants were freer to move about and to rent farms for themselves. At about this time, the peasants in many parts of Europe faced a shortage of open land. Most of the best fields were already being farmed. Moreover, high prices for wool encouraged nobles to enclose pastures for herding sheep, denying the peasants access to the land. As a result, thousands of peasants moved to urban areas looking for jobs, and cities and towns swelled in size. So there was a little bit of a shift from rural living to urban living. So the European economy had very diverse range of things that flourished, and many different goods were produced by various regions. Over time, some parts of the continent grew economically while others declined, as is most economic cycles throughout history. In the 1300s and 1400s, Italy dominated European trade and manufacturing. Merchants in Florence, Milan, and Venice developed large business organizations to carry on their activities across Europe. They manufactured, sold, and traded a wide variety of products. They also provided banking services for governments and other merchants in areas of Europe. Some cities specialized in particular areas of trade and manufacturing. For example, Florence was known for the production of woolen cloth and silk. Milan produced metal goods such as armor, and Venice dominated the Mediterranean trade. Venetian merchants bought spices and other goods from the Arab and Ottoman traders in eastern Mediterranean ports and shipped the goods to buyers in Italy and northern Europe. In the early 1500s, mining became an important activity in southern Germany. The silver, copper, tin, and iron produced in the mines were used to make various metal items, including silver coins, which became a new form of currency. Funding from merchants and bankers in the cities of Nuremberg and Augsburg helped mine operations introduce new techniques and increased productivity. However, in 1550, the flow of silver from Spanish mines in the New World made silver mining in Germany unprofitable. And there were many overseas explorations that contributed to the rapid development of Spanish and Portuguese trade in the 1500s. Spain brought silver from the Americas, and Portugal imported slaves, sugar, and other goods from Africa, which were highly praised in Europe. However, Spain and Portugal did not profit as much as they should have from the overseas trade. They both borrowed heavily from banks in Italy and Germany to finance their voyages. Moreover, the two countries shipped much of their silver, spices, and other overseas goods to northern Europe. Merchants in northern ports, such as Antwerp, profited as much as, or more than, the Spanish and Portuguese from the overseas trade. Let's talk about manufacturing. A number of changes in the organization of manufacturing and trade occurred during the Renaissance, especially in the 1500s. There were more guilds, such as those for the production of woolen cloth, that changed character. Owners and investors dominated the guilds, making all the decisions. Investors had considerable political power, which they used to advance their interests, sometimes at the expense of workers. So there was a lot of exploitation of lower class people. But that's not a huge difference from anything else that happened in the past. Let's talk about banking. Much of the increase in commercial activity during the Renaissance occurred in the area of international trade. This led the banking industry to expand to provide financial services that made it easier for merchants to conduct business far from home. Banks lent entrepreneurs the money to buy materials and equipment, to hire workers, and to pay for transporting goods. Without these funds, few people would have been able to develop large-scale trading enterprises. Banks also simplified the handling of money by introducing bills of exchange, notes that allowed merchants to borrow or deposit money in one city, then repay or withdraw money in another city. And merchants could then transfer money over long distances without the risk and inconvenience of carrying coins, because there were a lot of thieves and bandits on the different trade routes. So let's talk about the trade goods. A wide variety of goods were traded in Europe, which each country was known for a certain product. Although Italy suffered a general decline in trade after the 1500s, it is still the main source for fine arts and crafts, such as paintings, wood carving, sculpture, silver and gold objects, glasswork, and silk. The Spanish prospered during the 1400s from the trades and crafts, such as the leather processing and metalworking. So every area had their specialty. So I want you to think about why did all of this change? What systems came in place that altered any of these areas of thought? So pause the videos here and jot some thoughts down. Okay, so we're talking about art and literature, because it's what defines a city is their art and literature. During the Middle Ages, art was based off of location in Europe as well as the period of time. However, in general, the Middle Ages art can be divided up into 3 periods and styles. We have the Byzantine art, the Romanesque art, and Gothic art. And we talked about this in class. I guess it's probably been about 5 or 6 weeks now. But the start of the Middle Ages is often called the Dark Ages, and this is the period from about 500 to 1000 AD. And the main form of art during this time was the Byzantine art produced by the artists from the Eastern Roman Empire, which is also called Byzantium. So Byzantine art was characterized by its lack of realism. The artists did not try to make their paintings realistic, but focused on the symbolism of their art. Paintings were flat with no shadows, and the subjects were generally very serious and somber. The subjects of the painting were almost entirely religious, with many paintings being of Christ and the Virgin Mary. The second period of art was the Romanesque art, which started around 1000 AD and lasted to about 1300 AD, with the beginning of the Gothic art period. Art prior to that is called pre-Romanesque. Romanesque art was influenced by the Romans and Byzantine art. Its focus was on religion and Christianity. It included architectural details like stained glass art, large murals on walls, domed ceilings, and carvings on buildings and columns. It also illuminated manuscript art and sculpture. And then Gothic art came out of the Romanesque art. The Gothic artists began to use brighter colors,